I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. This is a podcast episode brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Welcome back to our Dvarim series titled Torah from Our Teachers, and this is our final episode of the season. Moshe is our greatest human teacher, and the book of Dvarim includes his monumental addresses to the nation. Each week, our guests have been sharing Torah learned from their most influential teachers. This week's podcast is sponsored by Sarah Averick and Jose Rosenfeld in memory of Sarah's Aunt Rose, Rachel Bat Chaim Nisan Halevi V'Nechama, a scholar of Yiddish who brought joy and laughter to all who surrounded her, and with her love of life, Uncle Mark Walter, David Ben Avraham, who escaped Germany and built a new life in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. They showered love and brachot upon all of their nieces and nephews. For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office directly. I'll also just say at this point that this is our first week that we are videoing these podcasts. That format will, please God, continue as the year progresses. And so we're excited to bring you also seeing sort of the behind the scenes of how these podcasts are recorded, along with, of course, our regular audio that will be uploaded to all the regular podcasting platforms. Parshat V'zot Habracha closes the entire Torah. It opens with the blessings or predictions bestowed by Moshe upon the tribes of Israel. While the content reflects the tribal realities and conquered Israel, the address is made to each tribe by their ancestral name, Dan, Asher, Yehuda, thus making it seem as if Moshe is addressing each child, just as the way Yaakov did at the end of Sefer Breishit. The parsha then recounts Moshe's passing on Har Nevo, the details of which have already been rehearsed 2 chapters prior. It is as if Moshe was already ready to exit, but interrupted this finale to address all of his proverbial children. The Torah closes with a moving description of how essential and unique Moshe's role as leader was and always will be for Am Yisrael. Our guest today for this final episode of the season is Dr. Yael Ziegler, beloved Matan teacher, head of its Kivuni program, senior Tanakh lecturer at Herzog College, and author of multiple books of Tanakh. Yael, it is a pleasure to have you back on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Hi, Yosefa, and hi everybody.
We are here today to speak about a Torah teacher who taught me, but I think didn't directly teach you, and who also has been on the Matan faculty for decades, I believe, Rav Mordechai Sabato. I'll just say that a few episodes ago, I brought a quote from Rav Chaim Sabato from his book, Emet Me'eretz Titzmach.
Yeah.
And he is his uncle.
I believe cousin.
Cousin?
I believe.
Okay. He is his cousin. So we're in a related field. So I'd love to hear a little bit about Rav Mordechai Sabato, and also why did you choose to bring him for this episode?
As you mentioned, he actually was never my teacher. Well, he was never my teacher in person, but he was very, very influential in my learning virtually. And this was, of course, before we had all these wonderful ways to access Torah. There were tapes, right? So the Herzog College had a very extensive tape library, and when I was on maternity leave with several of my children, I would take out these tapes, and as I was doing the things that a mother does on maternity leave, folding laundry and nursing my child. Yeah. So I would listen to hours and hours and hours. And what I loved about Rav Sabato, several things. First of all, was his incredible depth, right? He moved very slowly through the chapters, but he did it, and he did everything. He did parshanut, and he did midrash, and he also did breadth, and he tried to show how all of the topics come together. And these were things that really moved me and inspired me. At the end of my maternity leave, I think I had 100 hours of listening to Rav Sabato on several different books. And I always said one day my child is going to come into Rav Sabato's class and say, "Oh, I know that voice," right?
This, of course, predated what podcasts do, which is exactly that, right? How many people are able to learn Torah ala derech while they're folding laundry, while they're cooking for Shabbat? And it's a massive gift, meaning because on one hand, sometimes we need downtime and we don't always want to have content, but there are so many things we do in life that we're like craving content while we do them because we don't need our brain is not occupied doing those activities. So I identify with that. It's such a gift to be able to have that medium.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do believe I once told Rav Sabato, I once heard his shiur. And again, it was very rarely have I actually heard him in person. And I told him how grateful I am for his methodology mostly and what he showed me can be done with the Tanakh.
He actually was my teacher the same year that you were my teacher, because you both taught me in Matan's at that time master's program in Tanakh and Parsha. So I actually learned from you both the same year. Oh. So what is it that he has to? So we spoke his methodology, right? That there's something very methodical, something that's slow moving but goes very, very deep. That's one piece that is very powerful for him. Is there something else specifically in what he does? Yeah,
I think that he's very comprehensive. He really tries to show many different aspects of what it is that the Tanakh is accomplishing, and also from the world of Torah Sheba'al Peh.
Right. He was a Talmud professor in Bar Ilan for his whole life, meaning that was his big position, and not many people have that level of erudition, meaning he also could have been a Bible professor, is what I want to say.
Yes.
But he officially was in the Talmud department, and so that was like he has this virtuoso in two fields.
Yeah, and very versatile and has a real breadth and a real depth. So, there's not much more to say after that, because someone who has both breadth and depth, I think is really the person that you want to learn from. And then, a couple of years ago, he came out with this book, just of a few essays here, this book of essays on each parsha, which is a nice way to access him. Mm-hmm. The book, of course, is in Hebrew. It's 2 volumes, and this is a second volume. So, I was looking over what he said about Vizot HaBracha, but truthfully, I chose to speak about him for Vizot HaBracha, not based on this book, but based on an article that I read by him a long time ago, in which he offers a really kind of sweeping view of the Torah that can be encapsulated pretty much in one thing that he says about this parsha, which is that the parsha concludes with, or really the Torah concludes with these brachot that Moshe gives the tribes. But at the end of the brachot, there's kind of an epilogue at the end of the brachot where Moshe is preparing the people, preparing the tribes to enter the land, and he describes the land of Israel, and he says, you're going to come into the land, or he's not really describing the land, but he's describing the process. And in Pasuk Kav Zayin, he's saying, Me'ona Elohei Kedem, right? It's the dwelling place of the God of old, Umitachat Zroot Olam, Vayigaresh Mipanecha Oyev, right? And God, he expelled the enemy from before you, Vayomer Hashmed, right? And he said, he should be destroyed. I think this is the point that we say, Amen. Let it be also in our day.
Yes.
Vayishkon Yisrael betach badad en Yaakov, and Yisrael is meant to dwell securely. Again, when you're translating poetry, it's a little elusive, the exact translation, but securely and in a solitary manner, this badad here, right, which is so tragic in the book of Echa Yashva Vadad Ha'ir Rabati Am. Here, it seems to be something which is
a blessing.
Ideal, right? Yeah. Am Yisrael has a solitariness, which for good and for bad. And here there's something that is unique about Am Yisrael. El Eretz Dagan v'Tirosh, right, in this land of grain and of wine, Af Shamav Yarfu Tal, even the heavens will pour out with dew. Ashrecha Yisrael. How happy are you? How fortunate are you, Israel? Mi chamocha, who is like you? Am nosha b'Hashem, a nation that is saved by God. Again, Amen. Magen Ezrecha, ואשר חרב גאוותך ויכחשו אויביך לך ואתה על במותימו תדרוך. So I won't translate it all, but I want to say what it was that led me to Rav Sabato's idea on the parsha, and that is that he says, if you look at the words here, if you look at the words that are describing the coming into the land of Israel, they are the reversal of the words that expelled us from Gan Eden. And that, I think, is a remarkable insight, right? So that when you look in Breishit Perek Gimel, you see the same words that are used here to expel the enemy and to make sure that Am Yisrael is dwelling safely in their land are used in Perek Gimel to expel Adam and Chava from the Garden of Eden, and instead to place there, to make dwell outside of the garden, these kruvim that are preventing access to the garden. So it's these same words, and even the cherev,
the
right?
words like kedem, like vayigarish,
right? So if you look at the end of Perek Gimel in Pasuk Kav Daled, here I'll show it to you here, vayigarish et Adam, right? And so he expelled the human, vayashken mikedem lagan Eden et akruvim, and instead he made dwell east of the Garden of Eden the kruvim, ve'lat hacherev hamitapechet, and that kind of revolving fiery sword, lishmor et derech etzachem, to prevent access, to guard the tree of life. And here, 4 of those words that appeared in that pasuk, vayigarish, vayashken, cherev, and kedem, all appear to enable our entrance to the land. And with this idea, I think we have a certain kind of frame for the Torah, which is also gives us insight as to the very essence of the goal of all of Tanakh, which is to return to some kind of pre-sin condition, pre-sin-like conditions of what we had in the Garden of Eden, right? So God creates humanity, places them in a garden. And what is special about this garden is not the garden, right? What's special about the garden is the kind of life that we're meant to live in the garden, right? This access to God in the garden, the kind of high level of vigilance that access to God demands, and the way that the world responds harmoniously, right? Nature and the animal kingdom allows for a harmonious coexistence in a garden in which human beings are living their life on a higher plane. And that's what the land of Israel is supposed to be. Yeah. Now, I'll just mention one more thing, which is that Rav Sabato points out, and he does actually talk about that idea in his 2 very brief essays. So clearly he likes that idea, and he feels that that's a very foundational idea, certainly for this week's parsha. But he points out that there are many other places in Tanakh that hint to this idea. Right now, he mentions 2 of them. I think we could find them in, at least 10 different places that hint to this idea that Eretz Yisrael replaces Gan Eden as the kind of ideal form of existence. One other place that he mentions, which I think is really critical, is Vayikra Perek Kavav, which is Parshat Bechukotai, which are the blessings and curses. Yeah. And there, when you have the blessings, right, you have this kind of sense that Gan Eden, that what you're being given, Am Yisrael is told, if you do all that is good, then I'm going to give you, what am I going to give you? I'm going to give you a land where Eitz HaSadeh Yitin Piryo. I'm going to give a land where the trees give their fruit. I'm going to give a land where V'hishpati Chaya Ra'a min ha'aretz. There won't be any bad animals. I'm going to give you a land where Cherev lo ta'avor ba'artzachem, where there won't be any swords in your midst. And most important of all, I'm going to give you a land where V'hithalachti b'tochachem.
Right.
I'm going to walk amongst you. Hashem, Kol Hashem, mithalech bagan l'ruach hayom, right? God is walking in that garden, and God is also walking around the land of Israel in this, kiviyachol, right, so to speak. So this idea that we're taken out of Gan Eden and now we're given Gan Eden 2.0, which really leads to the question of why we don't just go back to Gan Eden, which is a really good question.
Right. So maybe before we think about that, I just wanted to point out what I think are the major differences, right? We have these common motifs. We have the cherev, we have the hitalech, Hashem's presence that is sort of ever present walking around, the kind of, thinking about like the hovering mother walking around that space. We have the vayishkon, or the word shachan, and we have a bunch of these motifs and verbs that are parallel and come in multiple places. I think a big piece of what comes through in our parsha is the place of the oyev, of the enemy. Because in Gan Eden, our biggest enemy was ourselves, right? Meaning the lesson we learned from that story, among many, but I think the main lesson we learned from that story is about personal responsibility. And if we don't take personal responsibility, then we don't get to stay there. Now, the message in the blessings and curses in Vayikra Kaf Vav, there we have this idea of, if you follow my Torah, you get to stay in this place. If you don't follow my Torah, you don't get to stay in this place. And then here, it's really, in our parsha, it's a blessing. What is the blessing? That your enemies should not be there, right? Which that badad, which is in so on philosophical conversation we can have, is what doesn't come true. It's what Sefer Yoshua, but really Sefer Shoftim says we didn't do successfully, meaning because we weren't the only ones there. We don't want to be an Am Levadad Lishkon on the international playing field in the way that we've made it seem as if it's ideal. Rabbi Sachs goes highly against that in some phenomenal essays. But that the point is that we need to be solitary or alone in this land. I'm speaking about the Torah. I'm not getting political at the moment. I'm pretending that there isn't a political dimension to that. But the idea being that the biggest blessing God could give us is that we will be the solitary nation in Eretz Israel, while full well knowing that what is sort of always hovering around us in the land of Israel are these enemies. Meaning, it's written right here. It's the reality in Sefer Yoshua, and it's even more so portrayed as the biggest threat in Sefer Shoftim. That is the take-home of the first 3 prakim. So I think that that's such a significant shift, whereas in the Eden story, it's about the enemy inside of us. Whereas here, once we're on the national plane, it's about the enemy that is external to us as a nation. Now, obviously, we need to wed both of them, and that already, I think, maybe can sort of think back to this. Why do we not go back to Gan Eden? Meaning, Eretz Israel is the opposite also of Gan Eden. It doesn't have those water sources, right? It's literally the opposite. It doesn't have that everything there for you, everything simple. No, the whole point of Eretz Israel is that we have to work hard for it, is that we have to work our way both on that level of enemies and also the agricultural level. So there's such big distinctions between them, while at their essence, there's a shared essence between those two spaces. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the 2 things that I think I would have said as well. The first being the enemies. And I think that really harks back to the whole story of Breishit, which, initially all of humanity was chosen to fulfill the purposes of creation. And at some point, I think what becomes clear is that in order to battle evil within yourself, you have to be battling evil around you. You have to be able to identify and see what is bad in humanity in order to be able to excise it from yourself. And that's why throughout Sefer Breishit, I think we see this kind of separating of nations and this constant return to the idea of sin, of human nature, of how to battle sin. And I think it results in this situation where you go into the land of Israel, but you go in knowing that you're going to have to continue contending with evil, with human evil, and that is a very relevant concept. You're avoiding the current situation.
No, I'm just avoiding the idea of ribonut. The idea of evil, and that being part and parcel of what is unfortunately part of our destiny in Israel, is to be that voice that's supposed to eradicate evil. I mean, we're stepping up. In our good times, we step up to that role.
Yeah, and I mean, when Yeshayahu says to Am Yisrael, "Kumi ori kiva orech," and he says, "Ki hinei hachoshech yichaseh aretz," he says, "Get up and shine." There is darkness that is covering the earth. So that darkness, the aretz hayta tohu vavo, that choshech, that darkness that is in the earth, it enables humanity to rise to, or enables Am Yisrael to rise to the task of ridding the world of evil. But first you have to be able to identify the evil and then to rid the world of evil. And the second point that you made, which is the point about the water source, is also present in this very short little section here where Eretz Yisrael is described as af shamav yarfu tal, right? That we're getting the water from the heavens, Shamayim, as opposed to in Gan Eden, which kind of prefigures Egypt, right? Remember, there's also that evil snake.
We've actually done some great episodes on that. I don't remember any more numbers right now, but we had a great conversation. Look back, and we had a whole conversation. It's my job to remember. But we had a conversation about Adafka, about that passage from Dvarim of Lo Keretz Mitzrayim.
Oh yes, I do think I remember
from
that.
Like 2 years ago. So anyone
from Parshat Aleph.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, I'll just, for those people who
don't remember 150 episodes ago. Right. Yeah, it's okay. We forgive you.
So I'll just say briefly that the idea is that when you get water from the earth, from the rivers, and you are the one who is creating the the channel system, and therefore you begin to take credit for your economic success when the waters come from the heavens and you're looking up. Right? So then you're meant to be reminded that this is not something that's in my control, that my prosperity and my economic success and frankly, all success in the land of Israel harks back to God. And that's also, I think, part of the story of the enemies, right? Yeah. So that Eretz Yisrael is kind of, let's call it Gan Eden 2.0, right? And we stand here at the end of the Tanakh on the cusp of re-entering Gan Eden and the cusp of going back to that ideal for which the world was created.
One more piece just to add about the enemies, and I apologize, I don't remember if I brought it in this forum or I taught it in the class, but in Rabbi Sax's book Future Tense, which was, I think, one of the most significant things I read this summer. I was reading a bunch of his books, but that one was eerily resonant in the current moment. He wrote it on the heels of an earlier war with Gaza. And so one piece he said also about enemies, he said that the land of Israel, in the topography of it, does not render it a place that can create an empire, meaning the topography of Israel is not well connected to the nations that are next to it. Either we're separated by ocean on one side, or we also have a river on the other side, and that the sort of the hills and valleys, that there's an element to the topography of Israel that doesn't lend itself to empire. And I just wanted to take a piece of that and say that in our parsha, where we speak about the enemy, when other nations, whether they're an active enemy or they're just a place that they don't want to be a threat, they go and take it over. But Israel, as our heritage and history, is not of an empire, meaning we never, right, took over spaces, right? We might have expanded our boundaries, but never beyond what was considered biblical Israel, okay? But we didn't create empires. And when you don't create an empire, the nations that surround you, unless you have a stated peace agreement, are constantly a threat to you. Meaning it's not only because the internal threat, let's say, of water or the difficulty of the way the land of Israel is irrigated, but also because we never were able to we never chose to just overtake everything around us. And so it creates a situation that not only because the enemies were left inside of Israel, which is the big fault that Shoftim finds in the way we conquer the land of Israel, and then obviously it's sort of a precursor for all the years that come after, but it's also because we never just overtook the lands that were around us. And so we're constantly this small country that's surrounded by other nations in a way that makes us very vulnerable to them. So I think that also, it comes through so much in the blessing that they're given here, meaning the emphasis on the cherev and on the oyev is something that is so strong. And it's sort of like, okay, like this is the future of our people. And a big part of it is because they're constantly living around us. Not only are they inside, but they're also surrounding us constantly.
Yeah, I mean, I want to pick up on that anti-imperialistic idea, which you're touching on one of my favorite subjects. I mean, I think this is one of the great messages of the Tanakh. And that is that the Tanakh is very much opposed to empires, for a lot of reasons. Partially because the Tanakh is very wary of power, very wary of human power, very wary of government, recognizing that that we do need to set up a state and we do need to set up a government, but that power in the hands of any individual and any government and any group and any nation is something that it can easily go awry, and human nature is such that it does. And if you look in, for example, in Sefer Chavakuk, Chavakuk in Perek Bet has a very, I think, anti-imperialistic kind of conclusion. All empires will eventually self-implode. But that it's not just a pragmatic, it's an ethos, right? It's not just, oh, you shouldn't be an empire because eventually you'll become too greedy and you'll, take more and more
philosophy against it.
I mean, think of every empire. Every empire just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. The Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the, Russian, the USSR. It becomes so big that eventually it self-implodes. But more importantly, that there is an idea that that empire will destroy us internally, not just that will destroy our nation, but that will destroy our spirit, our soul. And that's very much another place where it'd be interesting to think about it is in Breishit Perek Yud Daled, where Avram gets involved in this battle between the kings, and immediately after that, very warlike Perek, which is a chapter that is really steeped in military details. We have one of the most sort of spiritual chapters in all of Breishit, which is the Brit Bein HaBetarim, the covenant between the pieces, where God promises Avram a land, and the language mirrors each other in those two chapters, and I think makes exactly this point. Like, I'm going to give you a land, I'm going to give you a nation, but it's not in order to increase spoils. It's not in order
It's not to do that.
land.
It's not to be those 4 or 5 kings.
It's
to do
have
something
a relationship
else
with God, and eventually you want to create a spiritual empire, right? One where Ki Mitzion Tetzei Torah, but not where Torah comes forth from Zion, but not power and not coercion. I want to draw your attention to something that I had never noticed until I was reading these essays of Rav Sabato, and that is that he was engaged in something which I think a lot of us naturally do, and you even spoke about it in your introduction, which is to compare this chapter of blessings of each tribe to the chapter in which Yaakov blesses each tribe. Now, you could do a lot of things with this, right? You could go into each individual tribe. I think it's very interesting, for example, that Dan, his famous kind of symbol in Yaakov's blessings is a snake. But in Moshe's blessings, he becomes a Gur Aryeh. He becomes this lion cub. He becomes very Yehuda-like, right? So it's sort of natural to try to understand, the development and the distinction between them. He doesn't do that. Rav Sabato doesn't do that. He actually drew my attention to something else, which is that he says, unlike Yaakov's blessings, Moshe's blessings have an introduction and an epilogue. And he said he wants to see that as some kind of, development of the national vision, right? So that Yaakov is very preliminary stage in the nation, and Moshe is much more developed. But I don't necessarily want to talk so much about that. I want to talk about the content, right? He says, look in the beginning. In the beginning, we have this description of a theophany, right? God is coming, right? Hashem Sinai Ba. God reveals himself to us. And in what way does he reveal himself to us? So in Pasuk Daled, Torah tziva lanu Moshe, right? Very famous pasuk. Morasha kilat Yaakov, right? How does God reveal himself to us? He reveals himself to us through the Torah. And this is so much part of who Moshe is, right? So that Moshe is saying, as an introduction to his blessings to the tribes, he's starting out with this foundation of Torah. But what do we have in the epilogue? We just read the epilogue. In the epilogue, so, Rav Sabato says the epilogue is about land, right? How does God reveal himself to us? He reveals himself to us through land, through kibush haaretz, through the conquest of the land, through the maintenance of the land, through the prosperity in the land, right? And he says that's also part of Moshe's legacy. I want to take this a little bit in a different direction. It's actually what I'm planning to speak about on Hoshana Rabbah, which is really thoughts that have been accompanying me this whole year, which is that, Torah Moshe is so much a part of who we are as a nation. But, the Torah of Eretz Israel, it's something which we're really very fortunate to be living with that today. That's not something that Am Yisrael had the good fortune of integrating into their self-definition in a real way, in a pragmatic way, fighting enemies and, hopefully economic prosperity, right? Making the land grow, startup nation, becoming a nation that is also using its place in the land to make the world a better place, right? And that these two poles, he pretty much wanted to just go in the direction of these are the two legacies of Moshe. But I think that for our purposes, it's really important to think about the fact that we have a whole new form of expression as a nation today in terms of fulfilling our purpose. And I like to call that Torah David, right? Because Torah David is very much tied up with, government and autonomy and the Mikdash, right? Mm-hmm. And finding ways of building permanent structures in the land through which we can convey the glory of God, the name of God, the idea of God to the world. And so, when I look at this, this kind of ending of the Torah, and we're looking at that next period in which we're coming into land with Torah Moshe, certainly not leaving behind, chas v'shalom, Torah Moshe, but also able to weave in a whole new form of national expression, something that, of course, Rav Kook talked about a lot. Right? This, to me, is the ultimate goal of Am Yisrael, and I think that we live in very momentous times. Maybe some of us, didn't choose to live in such interesting times, but it still remains a great privilege to be living at a time that we can also find Torah David and the Torah of Eretz Israel.
So it's interesting. I want to go back to Moshe for a moment, because if you compare the Torah of Moshe versus his role in depicting Israel and Israel's future and the enemies of Israel, he obviously was much more involved in one than the other, meaning Torah Moshe remains Torah Moshe, meaning that is the foundation of all of our Torah. Of course, we have the development of Torah that will come after, but that really, I would say, that does have Moshe's stamp on it. In terms of how we practically deal with a reality in the land of Israel is, of course, Moshe sort of brought us to the doorstep, but then he was no longer there. And so I think that when I think about that legacy of Moshe, meaning I think that it's significant to say, I did all that I could, because this is also, of course, Moshe's dying now in this parsha. I did all that I could, but I think it's also, as you said, his role in one is much more direct than the other. Whereas here you're saying David, which is an interesting theory. I have to think about that more. I haven't thought about it as much in that way, that if he's our leader when it comes to what it means to be in Israel as an autonomous nation more successfully, let's say, than other leaders that came before him. And so that really maybe can get his attribution. But I think that that's a really interesting point. But I think that also there's such a big gap between Moshe's stamp on Torah versus on that. And I just want to say that, as on a personal note, that my daughter is named Morasha for this pasuk. Her name is actually Morasha Chaya, which on one hand we chose because she was born in the first lockdown of Corona, and so I wanted a name that had to do with life for her. She's not Dafka. Morasha is named after my grandmother Masha, and the Chaya was what I chose, which often is the opposite when it comes to creative versus traditional names. But the other reason, and I said this when she was born, is that the phrase has meaning a Morasha Chaya, like a living legacy, which is our Torah and also Eretz Yisrael. Morasha is used by Yechezkel to describe Eretz Yisrael, and so that this is something that I just wanted to say as like a literary compliment expresses what you said, meaning that this is something that's going to develop over time, and we're in another era of the development of this Torah and the specific flavor and how religious life interacts, hopefully enhances also our life in Israel. And that's something that I very much thought about when she got her name.
Yeah, well, actually, Marasha only appears twice in all of the Torah.
Correct.
Once in the context of land, which is in Shemot Perek Vav, and once in the context of Torah. So that, again, these two poles, which are meant to be intertwined, and which we have intertwined today. But of course, it's Moshe's great tragedy that he leaves a greater stamp on Torah and doesn't bring Am Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael, which maybe leads me to perhaps our last topic for today, which is the way that the Torah ends. It ends on a cliffhanger. And especially if we say that the frame of the Torah is this kind of Gan Eden and re-entrance to some kind of Gan Eden-like existence. So then the real question, this is a question that Rav Sabato deals with in an entire essay in his book, is why does the Torah end before we enter the land of Israel? I mean, well,
that's also the classic debate, is Sefer Yoshua, right? Should it be included? It's not part of the Torah, but should that be included as our foundational books for that exact reason? Meaning, how can you end here? The whole thing we've been speaking about and promised and preparing for hasn't happened yet.
Right. Well, Chazal say, Ilulei chatu Yisrael, lo nitna lehem ela chamisha chumshei Torah v'sefer Yoshua bilvad. Right? Had we not sinned, we would only have gotten the 5 books of the Torah and Sefer Yoshua, because you can't obviously leave us on and also Sefer Yoshua, more or less, is a really good period. It's a period of conquest. It's a period where we're driven. It's a period which is really marked by a certain sense of mission and purpose and completing the task. But again, the fact that the Torah ends and we do not include Sefer Yoshua as part of the Torah. It is part of Nevi'im with all of the halachic implications of that, and also I think all of the kind of sociological implications that we see it as a less authoritative book, even though it has so much in it that is important for the Torah. I mean, it's really the fulfillment of the Torah. So why? So why do we end like this without fulfillment?
Are you asking me, or are you?
No, I'm. Yeah, I mean, I could tell you what Rav Sabato has.
Yeah, what does he have to say?
So Rav Sabato says that he says what I think we know, which is that it's because Moshe doesn't lead them in, and without Moshe you have no Torah. And the reason Moshe doesn't lead them in is because of the sin of the spies. The sin of the spies, Rav Sabato says, is what brings the idea of galut into the world. He also admits that we already have galut from the story of Gan Eden. Yeah. But the idea that Am Yisrael might be prevented access from the land of Israel starts with the spies. And that idea is kind of, I want to sort of take this in a little bit of a different direction, but that idea is how we end the Torah. It's how we open the Torah, and it's how we end the Torah, with this sense that, what do we call it? The cherev ga'avatecha, the sword of our pride, which could so easily be twisted around at us, is something that we need to also keep with us, right? The whole story of Tanakh is a story in which we are given great privilege and also have to maintain great vigilance that we might not fulfill our goal. If, there's so much sin in Tanakh, so much sin in the Torah. Even Moshe is prevented from achieving his ultimate goals because of Am Yisrael's sins. He played a certain role also in the spy story, but he's certainly linked with Am Yisrael in this generation. And we take with us I think the hesitations along with the mission, right? So there's this, real dialectic that we have here at the end. We should never kind of rest on our haunches and say, I arrived, El HaMenucha ve'el HaNachala. And that has always been the cause, I think, of, disaster. And catastrophic disaster is when we begin to think that, we don't have to check ourselves and keep ourselves in check and be vigilant. And so there's something I think really kind of magnificent about the Torah leaving us unfulfilled. That's also part of the story. I mean, you teach Shir HaShirim, right? That's the end of Shir HaShirim also. Of, if you get to the end of something and you think that you've fulfilled your purpose, then you are going to fall.
So I want to pick up on that thread. I think there are 2 ideas that come up for me very strongly with this question. The first is just about human potential, right? If I look at Moshe as like our archetype, nearly perfect human, that even for the best of us, there are always projects left unfinished. No one person is coming to this world to complete everything. And if that's true for Moshe, who basically reached almost, the most perfected human potential, then all the more so for us. The most you could do is properly prepare as much as you humanly can, both the people that you lead and the next leader or whoever is going to sort of take that over. That's the best you could do, is to try and reach your human potential and prepare the world afterwards for their next stage. So I think just on like a basic human level, there's something very powerful about ending. The Torah itself ends with an obituary for Moshe. That is the end. Those are the end psukim. But I think on a broader national level, I think Tanakh itself, even if you just look at the way it's organized today, right? It ends with the word Vayal in the end of Divrei Yamim. Mm-hmm. Tanakh defies the idea that there is ever an ending point, which is what you're saying. I just want to say it a little bit differently. There is always a future ahead. We are not a story. If we were a story of a people that had like that regiyah, that resolution, then it would be a story in the past tense. But it's a story that's constantly developing. And I think that the Torah ending on this kind of note that isn't really an ending, and to say, okay, well, stay tuned for the next chapter, right? That's constantly that piece that stays with us. It's also deeply embedded in our psychology as a nation, meaning, I don't know why this started happening, but in the past few months, I don't want to cry, but in my like lullaby series that I sing to my 1.5-year-old baby boy when he's drinking a bottle, and I'm not like a big Mashiach mentioner, but it wasn't conscious. There's not that many things that happen to me in a way that are not conscious, but I started singing Chakelo B'chol Yom She'avo. Like I started singing a tune that is very meaningful for me from something about when I was younger. And I think about this literally every single night. The idea that like, no matter what's happening now, there's always going to be a future. And meaning, while there are those who their stated goal is to annihilate and put an end to our story, that there is always something that will continue. And I think that the Torah itself, Chamisha Chumshei Torah, and also the way that all of Tanakh is organized, really speaks to that point. Like there is no end point.
I'm going to add 2 points to that. Yeah. One is that all of prophecy ends with Hine Anochi Sholeach Lachem et Eliyahu Hanavi. All of prophecy ends with this forward-looking, I'm going to send you Eliyahu the prophet, right? Lifnei bo yom Hashem, right? Before the day comes. And the other point is that, and I think this is a really, it ties back into what we were talking before, which is a really important point, is that our other great leader of Tanakh, David, also is left with an unfulfilled mission. Right? All he wanted to do was build the Mikdash.
Yeah.
And Hashem gives him the right to gather the materials, to lay the foundations, very similar to Moshe, but no, you can't build it. No one person is given, I think, the ability to say, I've done everything, right? I've completed everything that I had to do. No, because there always does have to be that ability to be forward-looking. I mean, we are a nation, Rav Soloveitchik talked about this all the time. He called it unitive time consciousness, in a classic Soloveitchikian phrase, right? Yes. Where he talked about that we as a nation, we're never in now. We're always in then, now, and to be, right? Past, present, and future are very much intertwined.
Right, there's that
right?
piece there.
That's right.
Yeah.
And this is part of it. I mean, I think it's a beautiful way to end the Torah and Shir Hashirim and everything that we've spoken about, to really give us a sense that we never finish, we never complete. We're always looking forward.
I think what's also interesting when you look at that parallel between David and Moshe, that while David sort of lays all the groundwork and then his son is able to complete that task, I think what's also so meaningful about Moshe is that it's Am Yisrael as a nation who completes that task. Mm-hmm. And that it's not just, I didn't get to go there, so that's like a personal mission, but it's a collective mission. And so this idea that there are always legacies that have been left before that go unfinished, and so there's always work that will be able to continue on in the next generation. I think that's also really it's underscored by this idea of these great leaders who never got to fulfill that big thing that they want. They did so many other things. Right. They made such contributions, but they weren't able to fulfill that big thing. And it's what leaves space for the next generation to make their mark.
Beautiful. Yeah. So maybe we should conclude by wishing everybody Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe Marasha Kilat Yaakov. We should restart our learning with joy and passion, and always come back to this podcast so that we can continue to be creative in reading the same things that we read every year, but that every year what emerges are new ideas. And I thank you, Yosefa, for your great contribution to the world of Torah learning and learning the parsha in particular. So this is just, a moment of finishing the Torah, only to begin again with Gan Eden in our next parsha.
Right. So thank you so much for that, Yael. I just wanted to, just a few concluding remarks is that we've really heard from a really meaningful array, both of guests in this series, and we heard about different figures who they brought up. We had Aviva Zorenberg was brought up, Rabbi Sachs, Rabbi Bravender, Rabbi Yehuda Henkin, and today Rav Mordechai Sabato. And along the way, we learned about some less well-known Torah books, whether it's Rav Henkin's Shutim of Bnei Banim or his Torah commentary. And today, again, I think that the exposure to Rav Sabato is probably new for many people. He's also an extremely humble man. And so that also comes through so much in his teaching and the way he sort of conducts himself in the world. And we also, of course, heard about the really exciting new book that Rabbanit Dr. Adina Sternberg put out in the framework of the Kitwini program. So I feel like throughout this series, not only did we get to hear about some slightly maybe lesser known rabbinic figures and Torah teachers, but also and had some exposure to some of their works. Our upcoming series on Breishit explores sort of different our big heroes from each of the parshiot. We're going to be asking our guests what is meaningful and inspiring or powerful and challenging or thought-provoking about the behavior of a particular figure from that parsha. And we're going to be hearing both, of course, as always, anchored in our textual conversations, and really to hear also about what's meaningful for those people that are coming. And I'm really excited because we have a few returning podcast guests, and we also have some really great new ones that I'm really excited to sit down with. And stay tuned because we will be continuing to video the episodes as well, so you can either listen or hear it or watch us as well. So looking forward to that and wishing everybody a Shana Tova, a year of peace and prosperity, and please God, success in all of the fronts in which we need that. Thank you, Yael.
Amen. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.